Welcome to this online lesson on understanding medicine in the Middle Ages. The aims of this lesson are to describe the Middle Ages and some medical ideas of the time, to explain in detail key features of Middle Ages medicine, and to explain a link on how medieval society might help or hinder medical progress. This lesson should provide a basic introduction to medicine in the Middle Ages and could be a valuable revision resource. However, you are going to need to know the specifics in rather more detail than this lesson will provide on its own. Here's a do now task. Have a go at answering these questions to test your existing knowledge on the medieval period. Even if you've not studied medicine in the Middle Ages before, you can have a go at these to see whether you've got good existing knowledge of the medieval period from having studied at other times, or as a sort of pre-test to see what your existing knowledge is like now and how it might have improved by the end of this lesson and others. Question number 1, you need to say whether these statements are true or false. Question number 2, how influential was the Christian Church? You need to decide which statement best fits. Question number 3, which of these three options controlled education? Question number 4, what were the king's two chief duties? Just note down the two duties and leave out the odd one out. Number 5, how did ideas spread? Note down any of these statements that are true. And number 6, which of these statements best fits people's attitudes about medicine in the Middle Ages? And while you're completing those tasks, you can pause the video now. Press play when you're ready for some answers. Okay, let's have a look at some answers. We'll have a look at the answers to the first three questions here. Correct any mistakes that you've made. You might want to do this in a different colour. True or false? Well, people did not wash or try to keep clean. That is false. People did understand the importance of this and they did their best. You could be fined for throwing rubbish in the street is true. People believe that God sent diseases was also true. How influential was the Christian Church? The answer is very. We'll see in more detail exactly how influential it was on medicine. And 3, who controlled education? Well, it's about the church again. The bishops and the local priests tended to be in charge of the schools or any forms of education that there were available. We'll have a look at the other answers in a moment. Done your corrections? Okay, let's move on. The king's two chief duties were defending the country and keeping law and order. There was no duty for the king to improve people's health, although, of course, the king might get involved with that if he felt it was relevant. How did ideas spread? Mostly through handwritten books for the vast majority of the medieval period. However, printing was invented at the end of the period. Word of mouth was common, at least at a local level. Which of these statements best fits people's attitudes? Definitely A. At times, seeking new ideas could even be dangerous if it challenged the teachings of the church. You could be accused of the crime of heresy, which could have some very grisly ends attached to it. Alright, make any corrections that you need to, and you can pause the video while you do that. Let's move on and consider some major historical themes. When were the Middle Ages? Well, linking back to last lesson, if you did that, when were they? You should be able to identify that the Middle Ages is really the period up to about 1400, some people say 1500. There is some disagreement about this. It's important to realise that historical periods really blend into each other. It's not like they just decide, right, one year it's going to be the Middle Ages and another year it's going to be the Renaissance. They are a gradual change over the course of periods. However, for the purposes of the medicine through time topic, medieval Britain is a period 1250 to 1500, also known as the 13th to the 16th century. This was also known as the Middle Ages or the medieval period. Medieval literally just means middle age. Okay, if you are unclear on that date range, you might want to make a note of it now, but then we're going to have a look at some concepts that are going to be important for understanding medicine at this time. So how did the Middle Ages affect medical progress? Have a look at this picture. It can tell us some of the main themes. Notice that all of those people to do with the church, the monks and the bishops, are suggesting that things don't need to change. If you look closely, those monks are holding books with the word Galen on it. You might be aware of who Galen was already. However, we do have a doctor who's taken a slightly more rational approach. You might be able to guess what liquid is in that bottle that he's studying. But most people they decided to just pray to God to try and solve their problems and to try and solve any illnesses. So as a quick task, what ideas about medical progress are suggested by this picture, even if there was very little? Pause the video and note down a sentence or two to answer that question. Have a look at this artist's impression of a Roman city. This isn't any old Roman city, it's one in Britannia, or Britain, and it's the city that today we call Canterbury, although the Romans knew it as Duravernum Cantiocorum. The most noticeable building is the huge amphitheatre in the middle, which could seat 8,000 people. This was probably the largest one in Britain. This is the building in the centre. To the left of it we can see the Roman marketplace or forum, where also speeches and messages would be given. Just to the bottom right of the amphitheatre we can see a little pool in the side building, and that is the Roman bathhouse. You can see there's a lot of fires burning in there for heating up the water, for example. This shows some evidence of just how sophisticated Roman cities were, and indeed the modern city of Canterbury still has the same basic outline and street plan as the Roman city, so they must have got it pretty well right. However, despite the fact that we usually associate history as being a story of progress, with things getting continually more modern and better, this isn't always the case. When the Roman army abandoned Britain, things quite quickly started to fall apart, and quite literally. The expertise and organisation that was necessary to maintain a city like Duravernum Cantiocorum started to fall apart fairly quickly, and they started to be raided by invaders. Within a century or two, Canterbury looked like this. Clearly this isn't progress, this isn't things getting better. This is something else. This is regress, things getting worse. Progress versus regress. Let's think about medical progress, the improvement of medicine and the treatment of illness. Progress you might consider being a force that's pushing forward and making things better and more modern. Now, using what we know about the Middle Ages, what about it might slow down medical progress? This is called regression, or hindering, or in other words holding back or even pushing things backwards and making them worse. So regress is the opposite of progress. So that you understand those key terms, complete these basic tasks. Give your own definitions for the words progress and regress. Give an example of each in medical history. And finally, explain one way that the nature of the Middle Ages might regress or hold back medical improvements. You might struggle with task 2 if you've never studied this task before, but give it a go. Okay, pause the video here, and then when you're ready, press play and we'll move on. So hopefully we've defined progress and regress now. What about examples of progress in medical history? Well, you might know just from your own knowledge, things like vaccinations are an example of progress. Believe it or not, they date back to the late 1700s, although most vaccines that we're aware of today come from the 20th century. In what ways did the nature of the Middle Ages hold back things? Well, remember that picture we saw earlier with the church holding on to old beliefs? This is an example of regress, where the church kind of stifled new ideas or said that they weren't allowed. That would be certainly holding back medicine. Or if records were lost because of things like the fall of the Roman Empire, as we saw with those artists' impressions, that might even make things worse, which is an even greater example of regress. We're now going to have a look at some basic facts about medicine in the Middle Ages. Firstly, we've got some illustrative pictures there. Those are supposed to represent leeches, and that is a whip. Those are going to be quite important in understanding some of the other treatments and beliefs of the Middle Ages. So if you don't know really what they represent yet, don't worry too much. Life expectancy in 1400 was around 35, but don't think that everyone was dead by their mid-30s. This figure is very much skewed by the number of children who died in their first year or very, very young. So, in fact, if you reached 35, you had a pretty decent chance of making your 50s or even 60. Infant mortality, as I've already mentioned, was high. 40% of babies died before the age of 5 from illness or from poor diet. Many women also died in childbirth. Pretty much if anything went wrong, it was game over for the mother and often for the baby too. Medicine was focused on dealing with infectious diseases. They didn't really understand things like cancer. There was no treatment for heart problems or cancer. These were problems within the body that were not really visible, and so people couldn't really understand how you could control them or try and treat them. Diseases such as smallpox, leprosy and fevers killed people of all ages in Britain in the Middle Ages. No scientific understanding was had about germs or bacteria. Think about what might be important about that in terms of understanding what disease was and how you could prevent and treat it. Remember at this time that microscopes hadn't yet been developed. And even if they had been, there's no guarantee that people would see these microorganisms and really understand the implication of it. That came much later in the 1800s. Also, dissection, the process of cutting up human bodies in order to study them, had been banned by the church. Have a think about how that would be an example of regress or holding back medicine. Lastly, malnutrition, illness caused by a lack of food, was common in times of famine or food shortages. In the 1300s, for example, there were a series of devastating famines. One of the worst occurred reasonably early in the century and was brought about by a series of very harsh cold winters and wet summers in which the harvest failed. There was no alternative source of food, so if the food hadn't been grown, you simply didn't have anything to eat. This made people even more susceptible to things like heart problems and cancer, but also infectious diseases. Your task then. You're going to read the key information and then you're going to create a series of revision cards of this information. You should have a card for each of the following: health problems, treatment of disease, causes of disease, scientific and medical understanding. And as an extension, you could also add another heading of your own. If you've never made revision cards like this before, we're going to have a look at an example card in a moment, but they're pretty straightforward. If you don't have index cards to write on, you can quite easily make this just by putting sections on a piece of paper on your computer, or by simply cutting up a piece of paper into a series of small cards. Let's have a look at an example. Here's an example card. First, you write the heading on one side of the card. You can then flip it over, write the heading again, and include some details about that particular topic. I've taken mine directly from the diagram, but you should aim to have similar levels of detail on yours. Once you've completed your card, you've got a very handy revision resource. You can slip these in your pocket and take them around for you, so if you're on the train or on the bus and you're bored, you can just read these and remind yourself. But also, because they're cards that can be flipped over, you can simply arrange them in front of you and organise them from most to least important. You can test yourself on your memory of what's on the back. You can hand them to someone else and say, test me on this and ask me for facts on this topic, and they can correct you. There are so many different things that you can do with these. So once you've made this resource, don't bin them right away. Actually use them and engage with them and use them to help you really consolidate and revise this information. So here's that screen again. You've got lots of details on here, and of course you may put some of these details on more than one card if you think it's relevant, and you might not put the whole detail on there, you might just pick out certain things from it. Nevertheless, you've got the headings up there, you've got your task, and you can make a start. As an extension though, each card should have the heading on one side and up to 3 key facts on the other side, more if you can fit it on there. Use these by trying to remember what is written on the back of each card, and another person can test you if you like, as I described earlier. So pause the video here while you complete those cards. I reckon it'll probably take you at least 15, maybe even 20 minutes, perhaps longer if you make them really detailed or add some illustrations. But when you're done, you can press play and we'll continue. Okay, hopefully you got all your cards together. Perhaps you even added a heading of your own, or added some information from your own knowledge if you're using this as an opportunity to revise. Now we've got our cards, you should have a decent understanding of the overall themes of medicine in the Middle Ages, in particular the themes of progress and regress. You might be familiar with the Horrible Histories TV show. Certainly it's a gift for history teachers like myself, and actually pretty funny, so I'm a big fan. Imagine you're a presenter of the Horrible Histories measly Middle Ages show. Of course, if you are presenting this show, you're probably speaking to children slightly younger than yourself, so you want to bear that in mind in the language that you use when you write this up. You have a 1-minute slot to explain health and medicine in the Middle Ages, including things like progress and regress. Write a speech that is no longer than 5 lines explaining some of the key ways that medicine regressed in the Middle Ages. Remember again that you're going to be speaking to people who are perhaps slightly younger than you, and also if you can make it funny, all the better. You can use that as a summary of your understanding from this lesson. You can also use the revision cards that you've created at your leisure. But in the meantime, that's the end of this short revision lesson, just looking at the basic themes of the Middle Ages, and once you've completed that task, that'll be it. So pause the video while you complete it. If not, that's the end. I'll say thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been useful, and if it has, click like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you and goodbye.